We have 9 talks lined up for you this semester through November 16th, and you can see we've got some of the flyers on the tables there, but you can always check the ORSP website to get the latest information on our talks. These faculty staff forums are really a way for us to learn about some of the research that's going on campus, the research and creative activity as well. So I've always enjoyed when I've been able to come to them and learn something new, and I know that many of you are here for the same reasons. And before I introduce our speaker today, I would like to thank 2 people. First is Max Clark, who's handling the AV for today, but Max has helped organize all of the talks this semester and will likely do so for next semester, and his help is invaluable in this process. And then I'd also like to thank Rob Mattson, who was here just a moment ago, because of course without Rob we wouldn't have the capability to be able to live stream these and also then to take the recordings and put them on the website. So if you know others who wanted to be here today but couldn't, you can point them to the website in a few days. We'll have the video from the talk up. So kicking off our faculty staff forum is Dr. Jennifer Muehlenkamp. She's a clinical psychologist and professor in the psychology department who specializes in understanding and preventing self-injurious and suicidal behaviors. Her scholarly work is internationally known, federally funded, and has earned her prestigious professional awards. Dr. Muehlenkamp also uses her expertise to help with mental health outreach and suicide prevention programming on campus. In short, Dr. Muehlenkamp is what we call a superstar. The title of her talk, as you can see behind us, is Coping with COVID and UWEC Student Self-Harm, Risks and Resilience. And Dr. Muehlenkamp will talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. I just want to say to our remote viewers, if you have a question, you can email them to orsp@uwec.edu. That's orsp@uwec.edu to be read by to our presenter at the end. So Max will help us out with that too. So join me in welcoming Dr. Muehlenkamp.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. All right, all I had to do is show up and I get applause. That's pretty exciting. I'm hoping this can be somewhat informal as well, so you can ask questions as we go. My intent today is to share with you a few different data sets that I've been working with collecting data from our students. And given the prevalence of the COVID pandemic and how it's affected all of our lives, I thought it would be a topic of interest to everyone on campus. So that's why I selected these particular areas to talk about. I'm going to start first with just reviewing a little bit of the data that we're seeing about the relationship between COVID and suicidal behaviors throughout the world, in fact. Here in the United States, most of the data that we track for suicide-related deaths has shown that there was actually a decrease in the rate of suicide deaths in our nation for the first time in many years during the first year of the COVID pandemic. And that has stayed the same over the subsequent year that we have the data available for. This pattern of decreased deaths by suicide during the pandemic has been observed internationally. There is some variation across the types of countries, with some low-income countries showing some slight increases or stability in their rates, but many middle and high-income countries have actually shown a decrease in deaths by suicide. And what we see is that part of this is believed, experts in the field believe that the safety nets that were put into place, the structural safety nets that occurred nationally in many countries to help people ride through the lockdowns that occurred and the subsequent extension of those supports really were significant protective factors or barriers, because we know that financial stress, housing and food insecurity, not having access to mental health care all contribute to elevated risk. But during the pandemic, there was a rapid influx and a removal of some of those structural barriers that prevent people from seeking help. help. So barriers to getting online therapy and mental health support and providing mental health support groups were dropped. Many of them were loosened, so people, even though it was hard to get in, there was still actually an increase in access for many people to mental health care. There were financial subsidies put in place, there were housing subsidies put in place that allowed for more stability. And so those are some of the factors that people are hypothesizing, and we need more time to see if those are some of the true correlates of the reduced rate. But those are some of the hypotheses about why we actually saw decreases in the rates of death. However, there's inconsistencies. So a meta-analysis of studies that were published during the first 2 years of the pandemic, self-report studies looking at ideation and attempts, so not deaths, but actually just looking at self-reported ideation attempts, shows a different set of findings. And what they found is that there were slight increases across ideation attempts and self-harm behaviors, but it varied based on the demographics and the region of the samples, and that individuals who were younger and who identified as female were more likely to report those increases. And this is consistent with some of the data coming out from scans of emergency department visits, and that especially among youth, adolescents, and females, we saw substantial increases in presentation to emergency departments because of both self-injurious and suicidal behaviors. And public sector data, a more recent study that came out looking at, again, suicide deaths across 33 countries. The first study that I listed up there, that was during the early parts of the pandemic, and this last study cited here is the later parts of the pandemic, again, are showing no increases in suicide deaths, contrary to what many people are talking about. And I want to set the context here is to think about how our nation and how the world has been talking about the COVID pandemic in relation to mental health. Okay, because I think how, and I know from psychological literature, right, how we frame conversations impacts what people focus on, what they attend to, and then what they start to see in themselves. So that's just kind of a preemptive framing for you for some of the rest of the data. In terms of college students, which is relevant to the data I'm going to share with you, there have not been a lot of studies looking at this. There's one study that was published. Some colleagues of mine who work at a university happened to have some cohort data, and they compared rates of suicidal thinking among their university students pre and post-pandemic. As you can see here, they found no increase in the overall rates of suicidal thinking in their sample until you broke it down, and that students who were of sexual gender minority had higher rates of suicidal ideation post-pandemic compared to cisgender and heterosexual students in their sample. This is not a longitudinal study, but the most recent data published by the Healthy Mind Survey, which is a national survey of university students. We sometimes participate in this study as well. We're not included in this data from 2020. But what you see is that these are the general rates. And I can tell you from earlier studies that these rates are pretty comparable to what they had been pre-pandemic as well. However, with this survey, they did ask about COVID-specific risk factors, and you can see that concerns about COVID, COVID-related discrimination, financial distress, and having actually been infected with COVID were all correlated with higher rates of all of these behaviors in that sample. So that's kind of the context. So for today, what I'm really aiming to focus on, let's see if I can turn this, is using some of the archival and more current data I've been collecting here on campus. We're able to look at pre-post changes in our student-reported rates across self-injury, suicidal thinking, and suicide attempt behavior. So I'm going to share that with you. And I also have some data that we've been collecting as a screener to enter into one of the other projects I'm running in my research lab that looks at some COVID-specific variables and how those might relate to these behaviors in our students as well from more of a cross-sectional perspective. And I just want to clarify so everyone understands that non-suicidal self-injury is not suicidal behavior. By the nature, when I'm talking about NSSI there, non-suicidal self-injury, these are behaviors that people engage in where they injure themselves. So the stereotype is cutting oneself or burning oneself, where the individual does not expect that behavior to result in their death. And they may have zero suicidal thinking at the time they engage in that behavior. Whereas the suicide attempts and suicidal ideation, which are thoughts about suicide, are those behaviors in which a person is wanting to die. From that behavior, they're having the thoughts about wanting to be dead. Okay, just for clarification. All right. Oh, and I also want to emphasize that some of the data I'm sharing with you also comes from student-mentored research and ideas that students developed in my lab as well. So shout out to them. All right, so let's get started with the longitudinal data. So one of the questions, actually some colleagues and I wanted to answer, because the data I'm sharing with you is the UW-Eau data, but this is part of a paper that's under review right now with two other universities. So we have a 3-university sample looking at were there increases in the range of these behaviors among students pre and post-pandemic. So the data I'm sharing with you comes from archival data sets that exist and includes over 5,800 university students, UW-Eau students, across 5 years. And so you can see the years that are represented. We had 3 years before the COVID pandemic that hit, and then the 2021 and 2022 academic years, so after COVID, when we were collecting this data again. You can see the sample breakdown, again, is predominantly female and white. Okay. And what we did is we conducted a chi-square analysis to look at the change in proportion of students reporting the different behaviors across the years that we had the data for. So I don't have continuous data, it's really just how many of our students were reporting these behaviors on each of these years. Okay. So we'll focus first on the first one over here, which is the lifetime non-suicidal self-injury. And visually you can see a pretty strong effects. What we see is that there was not a significant increase or decrease in the 3 years preceding the pandemic. Oops, I jumped ahead. In 2021, this was a significant increase relevant to these 3 years, and then in 2022 we saw another substantial and significant, so a meaningful increase in the proportion of students reporting self-injury compared to the year prior and relative to the 3 years prior to the pandemic. So we're definitely seeing a substantial increase, at least in these couple years. We can't quite say it's a trend yet, just because it's only a couple years of data, but an increase compared to pre-pandemic rates of self-injury that people are reporting. When we look at, and notice that this is past year suicidal ideation, so in the 12 months prior to the date they're taking the survey, have they thought about suicide or taking their life? Again, in the 3 years prior to the pandemic, I mean, still elevated rates, so in terms of overall concern, yes, we want to have concern here, but when we look at changes over time in the proportion, it was not significant. We did see a significant increase both in 2021 and 2022 compared to the first 3 years, so pre-pandemic. So post-pandemic, we're seeing an increase in the number of students reporting seriously thinking about suicide compared to pre-pandemic, but these 2 years were not statistically significantly different from each other. So you'd say the rates, it's elevated, but in the 2 years is comparable. And then for looking at having attempted suicide in the past year, these average across to about 3% of our students are reporting that in the past year they have made at least one suicide attempt. That is higher than many of the national reports of college students, which tends to range closer to 1 to as high as I've seen as 1.9%. So we do seem to have an elevated rate here on campus in terms of people reporting that, but there's not a statistically significant increase or decrease across the years. And part of that could be because it's a low base rate behavior as well, right? And your sample size affects these results as well. So what this says, so just kind of summarize some main things. I'm trying to think the easiest way for me to stand so I can see my points. Our overall rates as far as self-injury, suicidal thinking, and suicide attempts are pretty consistent with national rates that people are reporting as well. If you think back to that study I shared in the very beginning, our rates are comparable, although the rates of suicide attempts are higher. Because remember, in the national study from 2022, it was about 1%, whereas we have around 3% of our students reporting suicide attempts. One of the things we do also want to acknowledge is that there's a lot of regional variation that we're seeing as people are studying the impact of the COVID pandemic and looking at rates in these behaviors post-pandemic. There's a lot of regional variability and subgroup variability too. So there's subpopulations that are showing higher rates, others are showing lower rates, even regionally. So with the other 2 universities that this longitudinal data is part of, Most of them found increases as well across all the behaviors, but there were differences suggesting that it's not just the pandemic that's contributing to that, because there were subtle variations both between years as well as regionally. Okay. So our increases are consistent with the international data. Generally, we're seeing there was a trend among college students to see very subtle, small increases pre-pandemic, but now we've got a substantial bump post-pandemic. So there's something about the pandemic that may have elevated risk there. And when we look at, so this is international data, I'm not aware of current US-based data, but the rates of that non-suicidal self-injury, particularly among adolescents, substantially increased during the pandemic years, internationally in some of the samples there, which is consistent with what we also saw amongst our college students here. And like I said, there are variations across the 3 universities. So one of the things to recognize is we're looking at the differences and the conflicting findings is to realize that, again, with all these different variations, there's factors, a variety of factors that can be contributing to these increased risks. And especially with college students, we knew that mental health was starting to get worse among college students anyways, and factors such as sleep, which are often compromised within university students, financial stressors, a sense of connection and belonging, all show a lot of variability during the college years and can impact the rates and the risks that we're seeing. So part of my next question then is I really wanted to look at how do those factors along with COVID-related stress or resilience impact students' reports of the suicidal thinking and the non-suicidal self-injury and attempt behavior. And I also wanted to take a look at this idea of COVID resilience. This is something I added into our screening survey because nationally, we're not having conversations about the fact that for some people, the pandemic actually provided opportunities to reassess, realign, and kind of put their lives in a different direction, resulting in them actually flourishing more and being happier in their lives and having a greater sense of well-being and prioritizing the things that really matter to them. There's a lot of anecdotal stories, but no one's systematically looking at were there any upsides, you know, to the pandemic and what happened around that. And so I was interested in, you know, amongst our college students, did any of them feel like they were able to develop better resilience because of the struggles they had to go through with COVID? So that's part of what I wanted to look at here as well. And that's also part of what some of the students wanted to take a look at. So the current data comes from a screening survey that I am conducting. It's sent out to a random sample of emails that I get to distribute to students. So voluntarily, you know, they complete it or not, to identify individuals who might be eligible for a different longitudinal project that I'm working on. But in that screening data, there's a variety of items, and so you can see our average mean age, you know, so we're mostly predominantly getting our first and second year students who are participating. What's most relevant here is that when we look at the past year, the frequency at which the students are reporting engaging in non-suicidal self-injury, it's an average of 12.8 times, so that's at least once a month. I will let you know that this is trending rather high, and part of it is I think there's a response bias because this is a screening survey, and in the instructions it does talk about the desire to help identify people for a study of like risk-taking and self-injurious behaviors. So we could be getting a response bias here, so it could be slightly inflated. And out of the 1,000 students, we had 37 who reported making at least one suicide attempt in the past year. Our suicidal, I don't have it on here, but our suicidal ideation item actually looks at suicidal thinking in the past month. So it's a different time frame, a shorter time frame as well. Okay. So it's a very brief survey that assesses some of these behaviors, and then these are the different constructs that we assess as well, which is 2 up to 4 items for each of these constructs. So they're not elaborate self-report scales. I did want to share with you the 4 items that tap into COVID-related resilience. These are self-created based on existing general resilience scales, but adapted and phrased for assessing COVID. And so students responded using a scale of 1 to 7, strongly disagree to strongly agree, to these 4 items. and it had really good internal consistency, meaning it has some reliability in terms of assessing the same ideas. So if you can see it here, it's looking like I'm impressed at my ability to cope with changes caused by the pandemic. I feel more resilient now than before. Since the COVID pandemic, I've gotten better at coping with uncertainty, and since the pandemic, I've got better at coping with stressors in my life. Okay? All right. So when we look at just that scale, the mean score in the whole sample was at a 4.5 basically, and that falls in the neither agree, neither disagree category, so the pretty neutral range. However, when we break it down by our participant groups and behaviors they may have engaged in the full sample, we had just over 41% of students falling in the category, the cutoff, so a score of 5 or higher, that they somewhat agree to strongly agree that they've got this COVID resilience occurring. And you can see, though, that gets smaller and smaller as we look at the suicide-related behaviors. So the non-suicidal self-injury group, we had just over about 22%. The ideation group, and then those who reported attempting suicide were the ones with least likely to report strongly agreeing or agreeing with the COVID resilience. Okay. So this is data that was actually shared at NCUR and at Circa this past year, student project, where we looked at we categorized individuals who would fall into like a low COVID resilience category and a high COVID resilience category. And the participants that fell in sort of that neutral range were excluded. So we had kind of more pure and extreme groups. But what we can see is that that COVID resilience category then was associated with meaningful differences. All of these are statistically significantly different from each other across a variety of outcomes. So social support. So those who had and reported higher COVID resilience tended to report stronger social support compared to those who did not. They reported fewer mental health difficulties, less hopelessness, greater self-compassion. And just as a side note, this is a variable that's emerging in the suicide prevention field as being a really strong protective factor, is this idea of self-compassion and giving oneself forgiveness for having flaws and being human and things like that. So it's an important variable to think about encouraging amongst our students in whatever way we can. And then also just general resilience, which makes sense if you're tapping into resilience, that would be there. All right, and so then to look at using the same data set, I looked at which of these factors seems to be most related to the level of non-suicidal self-injury, ideation, and then attempts as well. And so when we put all those variables into a linear regression controlling for gender and race and ethnicity, what we found is in looking at frequency of past year non-suicidal self-injury, there were 3 variables that were strongly related to and significantly related to the higher rates, right? So if it's positive, it means more depression and anxiety. It meant more non-suicidal self-injury. General resilience, so as people were higher in just general resilience, they had less non-suicidal self-injury. And same with sleep. When sleep quality was better, the rates and the frequency of non-suicidal self-injury was significantly lower. Okay, so out of all those variables, there's only these 3 that seem to capture variation in engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. When we look at, so this is past month ideation, so individuals who reported seriously considering suicide in the past month, we have many of the same variables, so general resilience, sleep, depression and anxiety was a strong predictor here, and then also the sense of connection. So as they felt more connected to other people, that thinking about suicide decreased. It's negative. What's also really important and relevant to the next piece we're going to get to, and consistent with the research literature, is having engaged in their frequency of non-suicidal self-injury in the past year also had a strong, significant, positive relationship with thinking about suicide. And this is consistent with all the literature out there that shows that engaging in non-suicidal self-injury is one of the most robust predictors of future suicidal behavior and suicidal thinking as well. Okay. And then when we looked at, so this was a logistic regression because we just categorized people as yes or no for attempting suicide. Again, many of those same variables emerged in that general resilience, sleep, certainly past month ideation, but also the past year non-suicidal self-injury emerged. I think one thing that's important to highlight here is that depression and anxiety, which is something that gets talked about a lot on campus here, was only a significant variable looking at past month ideation, but it was not, when we consider these other factors, it was not significantly related to the probability of making a suicide attempt or the frequency of non-suicidal self-injury. And so what that suggests is that when we're looking at the behaviors that we're really wanting to help decrease, looking at some of these other factors might be more effective in helping to decrease their existence. Okay. So what we see here is that this is all consistent with the existing literature, and as I was saying, the non-suicidal self-injury is some of the strongest predictor for these behaviors. And one of the things that I found fascinating was that the COVID-specific resilience didn't emerge as significantly related to any of these. Except for if I took out general resilience, sometimes it was, and so they're probably sharing variance there because they're tapping into the same things. So one of the things that I was really curious about is there's information in the literature suggesting that your belief in your ability to cope with very specific stressors, so my ability to cope with financial loss, my ability to cope with interpersonal conflict, my perception of that is actually a stronger predictor and changes some of the relationship between how risk factors relate to the risk behavior. So related to that, then I wanted to look at, does the COVID resilience, so this idea of specific coping, right, my ability to cope with COVID, does that influence the relationship between self-injury and the probability of having made a suicide attempt? And so I ran a moderated regression analysis. And this is a graph depicting what it is. So the solid lines are the raw kind of data points to plot, and the dotted lines are the linear interpretation of that effect. And basically what we see when I say by moderate is it means it changes the strength of the relationship between the frequency of non-suicidal self-injury and the probability of having made a suicide attempt. And so what this data shows, I kind of have it summarized here, is that the COVID resilience was a significant moderator at all levels of non-suicidal self-injury. And so basically what that means is when COVID resilience is high, which is this dark blue line, the relationship, this is the strength of the relationship between non-suicidal self-injury and the probability of a suicide attempt is significantly lower, even though it's starting to creep closer up here, but at all time points here, at all levels, it's significantly lower when COVID coping resilience is high. Okay? And when it's average, you kind of fall in the middle range. And when your COVID resilience is low is when you have the greatest risk. But that's also influenced by your level of self-injury. So collectively, you can see that when there's high levels of or a high frequency of engaging in non-suicidal self-injury, overall, right, rates, the probability of making a suicide attempt are much higher compared to those with more average levels of self-injury and those with low levels of self-injury. But the COVID resilience changes that. So if the difference between these three groups, even at high levels, for those who had high resilience for coping with COVID, were significantly less likely to make a suicide attempt than those with moderate levels of coping and those with low coping. And that was consistent at each of these kind of categorical breakdowns. Okay? So that's what this is displaying for you. So overall, what do we do with this? So what we're seeing among our students is that there are increases in non-suicidal self-injury and in suicidal thinking. Not so much in attempts, but still we know both of those precede attempt behavior, so we want to be concerned about it. It does reflect a potential worsening of at least coping skills amongst our students and potentially a worsening of mental health, which we know people are reporting nationally, and they were reporting that before COVID hit as well. Okay. I do want to acknowledge the possible bias in this data, though, given the purposes for what the studies were being used for. They're used to screen people who are experiencing suicidal thoughts to come into some additional studies that I'm doing. So it might be skewed in that way. Overall sleep and general resilience are consistently related in a negative way to engaging in these behaviors, suggesting they might be protective. And so when we start to think about what we can do as faculty and staff and individuals who are developing programming on campus, we want to think about how do we promote high quality sleep, adequate sleep, as well as how do we promote resilience just in general, and thinking about opportunities to highlight, clinically we talk about small moments of mastery, right? Those times where even if it's something hard but you got it done anyways, that those are moments of mastery, and if we don't attend to those, then we feel less able to cope with hard things in our life. So how can we really start to pull that out and highlight that for our students as well in a variety of settings, okay? Affecting their abilities to cope. And then I also want to just talk real briefly and then hopefully have a conversation about how we frame our conversations around COVID, because so much of it has been focusing on how COVID has led to all these hugely deleterious negative consequences, and yet we have data that for a small portion of people there has been some benefit that they've gotten from it, like improved coping and improved perceptions of their own resilience and recovery. And we know that that resilience then was associated with better functioning overall across a number of domains. And the COVID resilience specifically helped to buffer the strength of that relationship between engaging in self-injury and suicide attempt behavior among our students. So we might also want to really work with our students and start to pull out their stories of COVID coping. How did they cope with it? How did they develop some resilience? What have they learned about themselves from it? I can just, as an aside, as a faculty member, the semester that we did like hybrid teaching and stuff like that, at the end, one of my final exam questions was just a reflection of what did you learn about yourself as a result of the pandemic? And I got everything from learning how to be a better student to learning about how to manage life and things like that. And if we don't have people focus on that, then they can't bring it up into future times of distress to use it for coping. So I encourage us to think about those concrete strategies. And so with that then, my message is we need to balance our conversations about COVID, because even nationally, if all we're doing is hearing that COVID is destroying people's mental health, then people only notice and focus on how COVID is creating mental health difficulties. And we're not looking at a balanced perspective to say, could there also have been some other things that come out of it? Because even if you're experiencing mental health difficulties, you know, yes, I was depressed, I was stressed, I was anxious during this time period, and I figured out how to get through that, and actually today maybe I'm doing a little bit better, right? That doesn't negate the fact that COVID was part of that process that helped you get to the point where now you feel you can cope a little bit better. So that's what I mean about having a balanced conversation, because we know from cognitive therapy that when you only focus on the negative, you're only going to see the negative, and that makes it more powerful. And so the take-home message is let's look at how do we be balanced. Okay. So with that, I would like to open it up for questions and discussion. We've got a few minutes. I grab a drink of water. Yes.
I remember early on during the lockdowns, some people saying, "Oh, I don't have as bad as others," which seems dismissive. And then I sort of wonder about the feelings related to maybe having a more positive experience in developing that resiliency, but also hesitation to share that because maybe they perceive that other people had it worse than them. Thoughts? Comments?
Yeah, so I have a couple thoughts racing through my mind. One is that social comparison can be both an adaptive and a maladaptive strategy depending upon how you're comparing yourself. If you do what are called upward comparisons, where you're comparing yourself to people who seem to be better than you, that actually can have a negative effect. Whereas if you do some what's called downward comparisons, where you're looking at people and thinking, well, you know, even though this was hard for me, it was better than X, Y, and Z or these people that I know, that can actually have a more healthy protective effect. So in general, we try to recommend that people tend not to engage in a lot of comparison, just because sometimes then they also feel bad that they're comparing themselves to people less fortunate. So that's kind of the context around that. I think the hesitancy to share, my comment there would be we need to create a space to allow people to acknowledge that what's stressful for you is not necessarily stressful for me. And what's stressful for me and vice versa, and yet that doesn't take away the fact that it's stressful, right, and that it was hard. And so in being able to share, like, this is how I developed, you know, resilience, this is what worked for me, you can still acknowledge that there was a struggle that's there, and whether your struggle was more severe or less severe than someone else's really it doesn't need to matter, right? Because we're not in competition with each other for how horrible things can be or how great things can be. So I think it's part of how you frame it in having those conversations. And what I have done, again, just very little bit on the side, is really try to have people think through, you know, what did you learn about yourself, right? Or yes, acknowledge that there were a lot of downsides to COVID, but also was there anything potentially beneficial that came out of it? So you leave the window open for people to completely deny it, but by having it be more, what did you learn about yourself from this? Everyone could have learned something about themselves, and then you don't get as much of that comparison as well. So those are my thoughts on it, but excellent question. I think it's good to think through. Yeah, Mel.
In any of the global studies or any of those things, or or part of what you're planning, is anybody looking at the response based on whether the subjects tend to be introverts or extroverts? And the reason I say that is I'm thinking of, again, all anecdotal, variety of people that I've talked to, and who during the lockdown, it was like, this is great. I don't have to commute. I don't have to deal with my pesky coworkers. I can focus on getting my work done, because they were more introverts. And then others, of course, suffered dramatically due to the isolation and lacking the coworkers. So it just seems to me that a lot of the stressors, I mean, aside from things like worrying about, am I going to get COVID myself, right? But a lot of the things we talked about had to do with sort of the social isolation, especially during the lockdown. Has anybody looked at sort of that kind of variable in how people responded or what their resilience was?
So I know people have looked at like the idea of social connection and how that related and may have changed as a result of the pandemic in relation to suicidal behaviors. I'm personally not aware of anyone who broke it down in terms of the personality type of like introverted or extroverted, but I also haven't done the literature search for that, so someone may have. But I think right now, at least in the suicide prevention field, a lot of people are trying to look at what were some of those structural things as well as some of the more specific, like social connection, mental health worsening, access to health care, those types of things, which are our more common variables that they're hoping they can immediately target for the future. But that's a great question. I think something to look into, yeah. I've got some students here. Maybe they'll take that on. Yeah.
So I noticed that like a lot of the data varied by region, and also that this population you were looking at was majority female, majority white, which would be different than other regions. So do you think the regional differences have to do with demographics?
So there are a few studies out there to suggest that demographics do play a role in what we're seeing in terms of pre-post pandemic changes. And there are some studies, and again, but it's not consistent, right, across country or even across nations, other than younger age groups and females seem to definitely be sort of the consistent demographic group internationally. But even within the United States, I know that with deaths by suicide, which we saw an overall decline in certain subgroups, and I'm probably not going to remember which ethnic group specifically now, but I believe that they saw substantial increases in the rates of death by suicide among, I'm pretty sure, I think it was among Black and African American individuals, and I'm trying to remember if it was also among Hispanic. But that information's like not fully fresh in my mind right now. I do know that some studies that were also looking at like COVID-related discrimination and prejudice found that among Asian populations, that individuals who are experiencing heightened levels of discrimination and prejudice because of the COVID pandemic did report increases in like ideation, but we didn't see increases in like deaths or attempts in some of those studies. But definitely the social context and the cultural variables that occur across the regions play a role anyways in suicide risk, and then the COVID pandemic intensified them for some people and may not have intensified it for some others, so it's there. But even just like the 3 college study, when we look at UW-Eau Claire, the other study, the other university in that paper was from the South, and then one was from more of the Bible Belt. And generally we saw the same pattern, but like where we didn't see an increase in suicide attempts, the students within the Bible Belt University saw substantial increases in their rates of suicide attempts among their students. So that's what I mean about there's regional variation, and what's contributing to that, right, we don't know at this point, and that's part of what needs to be investigated.
Jennifer, I have
Yeah.
a frame. I love
Yeah.
what you said about framing.
Yeah,
And
I like framing. Yeah.
As you know, as we talk about often.
So the other piece of this I was thinking about is, I think I shared with you before that we've seen students who withdraw, they have, when they've been asked for an explanation, the rates of them saying it's mental health has increased during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not clear on whether that's about framing, right? That COVID may have opened up the ability for students to think about mental health as I'm stressed,
Mm-hmm.
that's mental health, that's why I need to withdraw, rather than the resilience piece, which is I'm stressed, here's where I go for help, here's the coping mechanisms I've created for myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if it's even bigger than the kinds of really problematic behaviors that you're looking at, but just mental health period has become this catch-all.
Yes.
For what could have
Negative
been
emotion.
normal stressors
Yeah.
of college life?
Yeah.
Does that sound right, or what
Well,
what
so
do
you're
you know
asking
about
someone who has very strong opinions on this, and I'm trying to withhold my bias and be objective about this. And maybe you guys could chime in too, since we've got some excellent representatives here. My take on it from this larger framing societal perspective is that in some ways our use of the term mental health has really become a catch-all, and it represents negative emotionality. As a society, we were going this way anyways, but COVID, like, you know, put it right in front of us. Is we've become a society that is intolerable of negative emotions, and we don't realize the value and the important role they play in our lives. And with devaluing that and thinking like we're not supposed to ever really experience stress or, you know, things like that. Or if I feel anxious, that's automatically bad because it feels uncomfortable. Our judgments on everything have become, as we know for many contexts, have become so extreme and polarized that it doesn't provide the space where true mental health is to be able to tolerate, you know, those areas and say, I'm uncomfortable right now, how do I cope with it? Where instead we're like, I'm uncomfortable, I gotta end it right now, I gotta get out and I'm done, right? And so I think that's what we're experiencing at a societal cultural level, because a lot of the treatment approaches really work on that, yeah, how do you tolerate this and cope with it? And because I don't know if I can say it's because of COVID, but I think COVID made a lot of people more flexible and opened more doors for, I'm trying to say this without being in a judgmental way, but I'm going to be judgmental, I'm just putting it out there, for easy exits. Right, and so and then when we know from avoidance, right, when you have anxiety and you avoid things, the next time you have to confront it, your anxiety is actually higher because of that avoidance. So the more we allow people to avoid and have easy exits, the less likely they are to then like return, let's say in terms of retention, right, and bringing people back and stuff like that, if they're not able to engage in how do we cope with things first and stuff like that. So that's my take on it. You know, obviously very open to discussing a lot more. Do you guys disagree with anything? I mean, I think I want to make sure that I'm adequately representing my ideas.
I appreciated that discussion because I see a little bit of both sides as like having that easy access of saying like, oh, COVID, stress, college, like that's why I'm feeling this way. But if we continue to ignore that and continue to ignore like those other life stressors that may not be COVID related, it builds up. It builds up over time. So I completely agree.
Okay. Yeah.
I think there might be like an increase in those kind of responses that you were mentioning, just because of the longer historical like destigmatization of having mental health issues too. But that would be more of a gradual thing rather than a recent spike.
Right.
Well, thank you for these wonderful questions and comments, and let's thank our speaker again for
Thank you.